Welcome back to episode 32 of the Universe Extended, our discussion on all things Star Wars and not X-Wing, but Star Wars specifically. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Ahsoka episode 5 with spoilers. So if you're here, if you have not, JJ, put the hat back on. If you have not watched Ahsoka, please turn this episode off because I don't want to ruin it for you, especially because this episode was such an amazing episode. Yeah, put it back on, JJ. Come on.
Hang on, I'm adjusting the.
You're required to wear that for every episode that we record together until the Super Bowl. So,
I put it to
if you want to know the inside joke, go back to Planning Phase Syndicate, our X-Wing podcast, and there's a bet JJ and I had about whether he has to wear a lion's head or a giant's head and all of that jazz. We're not going to get into it. Joining us tonight on this spoiler episode is Ryan Staniszewski. Thank you, Ryan, for joining us to talk all things Star Wars. How are you tonight, sir?
I'm good. Star Wars is great. I don't know if you know this. It's really good, especially now.
I know this. A lot of people, somebody like Nick Sperry doesn't really like Ahsoka. I don't understand it, but I guess
he didn't like it until this episode. He didn't like it until this episode. I think this episode kind of redeemed everything else that's going on. And again, it just furthers my point that you may not like a series in the beginning, but you have to see it in its totality with the whole story played out because it explains so much about Ahsoka's character, where she's been through, and why she acts the way she acts. And this episode did so great in doing a lot of storytelling, even for casual Star Wars fans that haven't seen Clone Wars, that haven't seen Rebels. This really provides a lot of context to Ahsoka's character, and this was absolutely my favorite episode so far of the season.
So, JJ, kick us off. Where did we leave off last week when we had who did we have on? We had somebody on.
We had Tim Bailey, Krabok. Yeah, we had Krabok. So we ended the last week's episode with Ahsoka waking up in what we assume is the world between worlds, where she wakes up and she sees her old master, Mr. Anakin Skywalker, appear to her, just saying, greeting her as Snips, and just seeing a DH Anakin Skywalker there. And we pick up right from that part at the beginning of this episode. Just a side note, I've got to say that Dave Filoni has done so much justice to the character of Anakin Skywalker more than any other person in all of Star Wars, because he's done a great job of really building out his character, building out the reasons why he fell to the dark side, and really just building up his character to make him a much more deep and complex character throughout the Star Wars universe. And we see that a lot in the Clone Wars, and we saw even more now with this particular episode of Ahsoka.
Yeah, and I think so. If you were not a fan of the series before, to me, this episode really brings like the Andor vibe to the episode. Like, I don't want to compare the two because there's a huge distinct difference to me in the telling of the story. And like, so this is kind of my argument to like Nick Sperry, right? Like, and those of you who kind of think this series was slow going or didn't have the this, like, Star Wars fans complain about a lot, right? Like they do. Like, that's like a thing. Like, everybody's so opinionated, hence why we have this podcast. But essentially, my biggest thing is like, everybody complained about not having like real fan service. Like, we've talked about that before, right? Like, we don't have fan service, we don't have any of these other things. Like, when they give us fan service, it's always these cheeky nods, right? Like, we look at The Last Jedi, we've looked at some of the books, and some of them give us very cheeky nods. But like, to me, Ahsoka is not just an Ahsoka show, right? Like, I love Ahsoka. Like, she is hands down one of my favorite characters, and I will give 100% credit to my son, James. He is the one that said, Dad, if you don't like Ahsoka, you are crazy. And if you read Ahsoka's book outside of the series, she hands down is one of the most complex, genuine, compassionate characters. that comes from like a realistic tone that we've ever seen. And to me, Ahsoka, the way Ahsoka works is they're not just gonna give us this BS fan service. They're actually saying, "Hey, you're a true Star Wars fans. Here you go. Let's give you a continuation of a series that never should have stopped." Like Rebels should have been a series that they continued for years and years and years. Yet we get what 4 seasons of it, and now we're kind of getting somewhat of a transition, somewhat of a change for that. So Ryan, what do you feel about episode 5 and kind of the transition, the discussion of how all of a sudden it looks like we're in a world between worlds, but spoiler alert, we don't really know if we're there.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty large discussion I had with my wife Sarah, like after we watched it, a couple days after we watched it. Like it was presented to us, this looks like the world between worlds. It's hard for it not to be seen as that. But also, was she actually pulled in the world between worlds? Or was this sort of trial and internal struggle all in her head? Like, because she
Yeah.
knows the world between worlds exists, like that's a feasible thing for her brain or subconscious to build up as like a setting for this to occur in her mind. But then you also think, okay, Jason heard lightsaber noises as part of the waves crashing into the cliffside as sort of a masking like effect of like the lightsabers clashing between Ahsoka and Anakin. So is it could still go either way. Like, how could he hear it if it wasn't actually happening? But if he's
So
in tune with the Force, then he could still make a connection with her and still feel and hear her
yeah.
struggle through the Force. And
So for
I
me,
I I really like how there's no answer to this yet, and it's up to interpretation of the viewer.
honestly, I think there is an answer for it because if you go back to Rebels, right, there's the two episodes where they go into the Jedi Temple at Lothal, particularly the second time that they go in there with Ahsoka. We see these Force visions come to life, right, and they weren't in the world between worlds. You know, we get a moment where the Inquisitors track them down and they enter the temple, and then we get a scene where the Jedi Temple guards that were essentially training Kanan to become Jedi Knight come out and attack these Inquisitors to imprison them, allowing them to escape. Right now, this is actual Force visions that actually had a real life tangent to the physical realm of where they were, so they can hear them, they can interact with them, and they can be affected by them. So I think it's something similar to that. That at that particular area, it was a force hotspot, sort of, especially since the Nine Sisters built that area there to essentially use their connection to the force to use the map in order to follow the Purgle. Color area was strong in the force, and thus this allowed Ahsoka to further connect into the force in her moment where she's at her lowest in order to have that vision and be there. Honestly, I don't believe that she entered the world between worlds because from what we at least seen from Rebels, there has to be a portal for them to enter and to exit. And we don't see either of that when Ahsoka enters. In fact, when she finishes the vision, all of a sudden the water starts rising up, and it's like her mind is returning to where she actually is physically.
Well, I think that's a good point because I think it says, is this the world between worlds or is this just like a force vision, right? Like, is she precognizant? Does she have the ability to see things that could happen that did not? Um, and I will say, like, we go into basically essentially seeing her almost as a youngling. Like, I don't know if she's quite a youngling in this or not. Like, she's on that verge um with Anakin, and they talk about, what's going on and her having to kill things, and she really doesn't want to kill things. She doesn't want to do all these things, and we see her with all the clone troopers, which I will say, like, it's weird seeing some of this because, like, we've not seen live action clone troopers before, and we've never seen baby Ahsoka ever. Like, outside of, I guess, Tales of the Jedi has a baby Ahsoka, but outside of that, we've not seen baby Ahsoka in any action based story we've ever been given. So, what do you guys feel about kind of the visions that we're seeing? Like, do you feel that these are true flashbacks, or are these kind of like her interpreting how she felt during these beginning times?
I think I definitely feel like it's the force bringing her into her own interior worlds in order to resolve it, because the way that they interpret the scenes when she's a youngling and experiencing her first battle with Anakin around her, you have that whole fog that's around her, right? And she's only seeing what she immediately remembers, which is all the blast of fire in the background, her focusing on Anakin as he's leading her through to the first battle, and then just the heck, the craziness of the war that's going around her. It gives her that sense of panic, and she can only imagine like what was immediately around her there. And then fast forward to later on, the memory becomes a little more wider, right? Because she's more in a calmer state, right? This is post the battle. I For what I think it was the Battle of Ryloth, where she sees a couple of the Twi'leks in the background. Those are parts of her memory that remember it better because it's not as hectic, whereas that first memory is a little more closer. And then we get to when she's much older, the Siege of Mandalore, where she's starting to remember the fight she had against the Mandalorians that were under Maul's rule. Which, side note, they nailed those costumes perfectly. Like, I love seeing those in live action. And then, of course, the appearance of Rex as well. Um, so, like, to me, those little bits of information makes it feel like she's having more of an internal moment in her connection to the Force, and I think that's what that really is.
Ryan, what do you feel?
So I think one of the things that this episode encapsulated that none, and this was mentioned a couple times online, I do agree with it. None of the cartoon episodes could really encapsulate how it really could be portrayed or feel. Is Ahsoka is a teenager in the Clone Wars. She's a Padawan. You've been told this. You see it sort of in the cartoon or the 3D rendition of her. To see it in live action really puts into perspective just how young he
Hmm.
was in with her directly dealing with a killed clone in action on a medic bed. Like, immediately puts you into, this is tragic. Like, what
Hmm.
she had to deal with and basically was taught through and grown up through is bad. This was not good for her. It tuned her into a like extremely good warrior, but like at for dealing with it as a person, no one should have to go through that in that age, right? The Jedi were probably wrong for putting Padawans in those situations. I mean, they were eventually they find out they were wrong for participating in the war in total, right? But um, I don't think any of the previous portrayals of Ahsoka in animated form could really ground us into the reality that, sure, we read and knew she started at 14 and ended the Clone Wars at 17. It still looked like by the end of the Clone Wars she was like early 20s, maybe. Like, it seemed more like, because her as a character sounded and felt more mature than 17, right? But that's what just she had to be, right? But seeing a live action person around that same age play that really puts you back into the, man, she really was that young. Which also, the actress, by the way, for people who don't know, played the little version of Gamora from the flashback scenes from Infinity
Yeah.
War from Thanos. And apparently is also in Barbie. So this actress is a great early life actress right now, having some big roles, and a lot of people really want to see her in more Ahsoka live action in Clone Wars. I don't know if we're gonna get it. I don't know if we really need it, but it'd be cool.
Yeah, and if you think about it, like I don't know if either of you read any of the books, but like I'm in the High Republic series right now, and essentially I'm reading any of the ones where the books are more than like 4.5 hours. Like if they're less than 4.5 hours, I'm not reading them because it seems silly to pay that kind of money. But if you go through and you look at the Nihil attacks, and I guess we're already in spoilers, so I don't have to say that, but if you talk about Nihil attacks and you know the Starbase and all these other things, you talk about these Jedi, and we're talking like lots of Jedi, like more even so than during the Clone Wars. Um, and that's when the Jedi were very prominent. There is a lot of Padawans who are very young going through these large scale attacks, going through this mass murder, this whole situation. And I think if you could take the two and complement two together, you can see, you know, kind of the reflex side between the two, right? And to Ryan's point, like, hey, why is a 14, 15-year-old having to murder people? Like, come on, like we
Mhm.
don't do that in most nations. We don't do that. We don't go, "Hey, you're 14, boom, you're in the army and you're going to go murder people." We don't do those things. Um and I think that's like a big call out that we kind of see in this because Ahsoka has always struggled with should I train, should I not train, should I get close, should I not get close. And if you've read her book, the book that focuses around what she kind of does afterwards, where she goes, and who she tries to help, you see that struggle, like that huge struggle she has internally. Because she doesn't know should she be a part of this, should she not? And here we are so many years later, and she's struggling with should I train Sabine, should I not? Right? Like, what does the Jedi say? We don't train people that typically aren't force sensitive. We don't train people that haven't had a big training throughout their youth. And now you're in a predicament where it's like, does the force matter enough that we should spend our time training these people or not? And I feel this episode, like personally, I feel this episode kind of encapsulates that because it's not Anakin saying, "Hey, I'm here to train you better." It's Ahsoka's conscious saying, "Anakin, where in God's green earth were you?" You know, like, "Why did I have to go through this and you trained me and then disappeared? I had no confidant. I had nobody here for you." Um, and maybe that's just my personal feeling, and that's why I like this episode a lot because it feels like this episode is the Ahsoka growth episode where we can kind of see where she has to go back and confront things she had no interest in confronting at all.
Yeah, for me, I think it was a lot more of Ahsoka just feeling the guilt for not being there during the time that Anakin fell. You know, her guilt for, you know, her that trauma that she experienced of sending clone troopers to their deaths. You know, that burden of command that she had to experience very early on, and you know that all leads to the reason why Ahsoka could not work with Sabine originally. She had all that prior experience with commanding troops and commanding people that she eventually cared about. You know, these are people that trained her, that she fought with and bled with, and eventually died. And, you know, we've seen that at the end of Order 66, where she had to bury a lot of her friends from the 501st that helped join up with her and fight in the siege of Mandalore. We saw that in countless battles that she's been in, and that fear that she had in her is what prevented her with connecting with Sabine in her training. And of course, you know, her trauma that she experienced in seeing what Anakin had become, and made her fearful of her becoming the same way. You know, we see a lot of Anakin's influence in her, you know, especially when she pretty much, in no uncertain terms, say that she pretty much tortured Morgan Elsbeth into giving her that information. You know, it's not the Jedi way, it's not the Jedi protocol. So she's been flirting that line between, you know, the dark and the light, and she has that fear of herself of turning out the same way that Anakin did, and her confronting Anakin. And by the way, that the lightsaber scenes, the animation effects that they did for Hayden Christensen as he turns from the dark side to the light in that battle, just awesome.
Well,
But
and
it
I
helped
think
resolve that.
yeah, I think the other thing is right there, right, is he tells her we get old, right? Like he talks about that, and then explains that um, you know, sometimes Jedi lead and make mistakes, right? And those mistakes bother him. And I think that's why we can humanize Vader. Like even though Vader was a turned out to be a very horrible person is the nicest way to put it, right? Like Vader is not somebody you want to emulate, but at the same token, we have Vader's redemption at the very end, right? But we have somebody that we can now kind of go back to and relate to because we can see Vader, we can see Anakin as he transitioned, like grasp and struggle with some of these horrible decisions he had to make. I mean, he's on he's at home slaughtering children. She's on Mandalore trying to defend, Mandalorians, right? Like there's a huge difference in where the two of them are at. And even though he's the chosen one, he's the one that's supposed to be here. We have Ahsoka over here actually fighting for the people. She's fighting against these things. And Ryan kind of pointed out earlier that she does a very similar, move against Anakin that she does against Maul. Is that a reflection? I don't
I
know.
don't know. I don't know. It's close.
I do really like the sort of enlightened look we got to Ahsoka after her vision, after she recovered herself. Like she pulled a Gandalf, right? She went
Yeah, she
from
did.
Ahsoka the Grey to Ahsoka the White. Um, now we had seen that sort of get up at the very end of the Rebels series. That kind of this show portrayed a little differently in that she went to go get Sabine to go find Ezra in some capacity in a similar aspect between the end of Rebels and the live action Ahsoka now, but we also didn't see her in the same getup until this point. So a little bit of story rewrite to get it to a more satisfying, reasonable representation as to what that really means to Ahsoka now. As she we'll see how like she had a tough time dealing with Balin's skull before.
Yeah.
Granted, her hand got burned from probably the Night Sister magic that might have been protecting that orb at the time from Morgan Elsbeth. But I think wherever Ahsoka's going to find Sabine, Ezra, Thrawn, everyone, I think she's going to show a new level of
Mastery.
yeah, mastery in her next fight with Balin.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, the level of the choreograph for the fight, the lightsaber fight between her and Anakin, which is so great, and it just shows that there's more that she's going to bring out in her follow up fights. That I can't wait to see how they do that. I mean, the just the attention to detail on her mimicking the same moves that she did in the Clone Wars series. I know you sent me that Twitter where she did that kick very similar to the battle versus Maul that she did with Anakin. I mean, it's just perfect, like almost frame for frame, basically. I definitely like that. Side note, towards the end, we do see her, go in front of a purgle and use the force to essentially allow it to allow the ship to go inside so that way they can travel in their path. I felt, it was a very Finding Nemo moment where, she was speaking whale. Do you
Yep.
think do you think that there's enough space in there for both the Jedi cruiser and for the ghost to fit inside the whale?
It seemed like Hera had to deal with the rebel with the New Republic officials at this point. So
Yeah.
unfortunately, I at this point I think it actually did make sense for Hera to stay back because at least there's a small chance that she could uh submit her petition to like, hey, something's gonna come back. Hopefully, it's just Ahsoka, Sabine, and everyone else. We want to come back, and there's not also a Thrawn with them too, type of thing, where it's like we have to deal with also this type. Um, Actually, so I just thought about this. If they were like drawing parallels and like next level of Ahsoka mastery, I kind of just imagine like, what if Ahsoka does Anakin's like lightsaber twirl in the fight against, like just as an
Oh,
homage
that'd
to
be
her
great.
master, but then also like just accepting that she's part of the lineage. But she's utilizing the best parts of Anakin to make her a better master of the Force, and just uses Anakin's lightsaber like behind the back twirl as an attack against Balin at some point.
That would be great, actually. I would love to see that. Oh man.
So I think we wrap the episode up because we see her leave. We see Hera left to deal with whatever is going to happen, and I agree because I don't agree that Thrawn's going to come back and be a big threat. I think Thrawn's going to come back and be this unneeded ally. But that's because I read the books and I feel that we need to move closer to the books. And the longer we go through this, JJ has been prophesying, but this is going to be the heir to the Empire Thrawn that we're going to get. This is
No.
the old school Thrawn.
He's
But
an antagonist, but not necessarily a villain.
look, we
So yeah.
haven't seen him for 5 episodes now.
I know. I feel like he's
5
going to show up in the
episodes.
last episode, and then that's it. We won't see him again until
Yeah.
the Filoni movie.
So my theory is, I feel my theory versus yours is a million times more valid because of the fact that we aren't seeing Thrawn. He's not a big part of this whole thing. That in the long run, we're building up to like, oh my God, Thrawn's going to be this big evil. But really, Thrawn's here to help us because if you go back through the books, like I've stated before in previous Universe Extended episodes, if you go through the books, Thrawn and all of his allies anticipated Palpatine because of the Grisk and because of I can't remember the guy's name, the stupid popular pisses me off because I can't remember this guy's name. But because of the specific Grisk
Oh,
antagonator.
Jixus.
Yes, there.
Yeah, Jixus. Yeah.
Because of how Jixus is, that in the long run, Thrawn has always been playing the long game with Palpatine, and that he's going to come back and like we're going to get a vision of him helping orchestrate how Rey gets set up to beat Kylo and Palpatine in the long run, and it'll make all those sequels a little bit better than they already were. So. All right.
I just hope that we don't all of a sudden see next episode they go back to Mando and Grogu for like another 2 episodes. I just hope that doesn't happen, man.
Stop it. JJ, that's not gonna happen. Not gonna happen. All right. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to talk Ahsoka in this time. I love the show. I don't care what anyone says. Like I like Andor for what Andor does, but I love Ahsoka for what Ahsoka does. And I don't care what anyone says. To me, this is hands down equal to Andor in its own correct right. But I don't know. I love this. I love this episode or this show, and I love this episode. And I feel, I don't know. I feel this series in and of itself is like totes magoats amazing. I don't know. So
Yeah.
But anyway.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for joining us. We will be back next week with a X-Wing podcast called Planning Phase Syndicate, where we talk about X-Wing things. And we will have another Universe Extended episode coming to you either next week, Wednesday or Thursday, or next week, Sunday, depending on JJ's schedule. With that being said, thank you. Have a good night, and we will see you on the Flippity Flop.
Have a good night, everybody.